I'm Dr. Duke with the New American. Well, any of you who in high school had to read Charles Dickens' classic, A Tale of Two Cities, you may remember the classic opening. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, and the series of juxtapositions. We have our own Tale of Two Cities this past week in Washington, D.C., and just across the border in Virginia. And what you've got is a tale of two cities. It was the best of times, it was the most dumb time. It was a completely clueless time and an utterly woke time. Because the way the media covered these two stories, the fourth annual Women's March on Washington, D.C. that took place this past weekend, where supposedly hundreds and hundreds of thousands of women were supposed to descend upon Washington, D.C. to actually protest against the evil orange Donald Trump. And it didn't happen. The numbers were the lowest they have been in each of the last 4 years. The numbers dropped precipitously. The protest itself fizzled out, petered out. It was not in any way, shape, or form the kind of protest that matters. It suggests something really, really important that the media is too crooked to tell you, that the anti-Trump protests have lost steam. Between Trump's economic success, which is undeniable. I mean, hard to be a feminist and hate Trump when women's participation in the workforce is at the highest level it's ever been, where real wages for women are at the highest levels they have ever been. And so you factor into that impeachment, you factor into that Donald Trump's endearing popularity among his own people, you factor into that this nakedly partisan witch hunt that the Democrats are engaged in, and the Women's March didn't turn into much of a Women's March at all. It was a failure. And you know how you know it's a failure is because the media had almost nothing to say about it. That very first year, back in 2016, when Trump was elected president, that first march in January of 2017, you had 400,000 people hit the streets of Washington on every front page. The local news was cutting out to show you these protests. And with each subsequent year, it's diminished dramatically to the point now that they can't even really report on it. It's a failure. But right across the border into Virginia, you had the other protest where tens of thousands of pro-Second Amendment Virginians descended upon major cities in Virginia to protest what Governor Northam was doing to limit gun access, to undercut the Second Amendment. That was a real protest. In fact, that protest actually put to shame what was taking place in Washington in terms of its relevance, in terms of its passion, in terms of its newsworthiness. And the irony is that before the first protester ever descended into the capital of Virginia, you had the governor of Virginia and his willing media thralls in the left-wing media going out of their way to paint this as the second coming of a Klan's rally. The irony of this, right, that because pro-Second Amendment people were going to flood the Capitol on a day, by the way, that every year was used to lobby. This was Martin Luther King Day. Every Martin Luther King Day in Virginia, it's also known as lobbying day for various groups to come to the Capitol and lobby politicians. The fact that more than 20,000 pro-Second Amendment people came was unusually large for one issue. And the media from the beginning turned this into a white supremacist gathering. This was Klansmen. This was going to be violent. You were going to have shooting. So the governor, in a very, very questionably legal move, actually called for a ban on weapons in the Capitol that day. They weren't going to allow them, that anybody possessing a weapon could potentially be arrested. He used his executive authority to, on the cuff, by word of mouth, basically ban guns because you're trying to smear the protesters, the ones who wanted to support the Second Amendment. This is really interesting to me because you got this tale of two cities. You've got the really liberal city of Washington, D.C. In fact, the reason the reason Virginia has turned blue, that you have a Democrat governor and you have a majority in the Democrat House and the Senate, is because of the influence of Washington, D.C. The northern part of Virginia has been completely overrun by Washington bureaucrats, by radical progressive Washingtonians who have moved into Virginia to find actually affordable housing. That's what's tipped the red state of Virginia blue. But the irony about that is outside those very woke regions, oftentimes populated with huge numbers of Beltway people, you now have in the rest of Virginia a very, very, very conservative base. It's the same thing in my home state, the state that I'm living in Wisconsin. Outside of Milwaukee and Madison, the two big liberal cities, it's all conservative. And the same thing is largely true in Virginia as well. Outside of that Beltway Washington enclave, Virginia is a very conservative state. It's a southern state. And we know this because of the number of counties in the state of Virginia that have actually came out and declared themselves Second Amendment sanctuary counties. It's an amazing thing. You have dozens and dozens of sheriffs of these counties in rural Virginia who vow not to enforce these radical gun confiscation plans of Governor Northam. So we have, again, a tale of two cities. You've got Washington and its Women's March, a march full of stupidity, a march full of vagueness and ambiguity. In fact, most of the march had nothing to do with women's issues. Overwhelmingly, the protesters who did show up in Washington, D.C. over the past weekend for the Women's March were protesting Trump. Not necessarily Trump for being a man, not necessarily putting forth women's issues, but simply another anti-Trump rally. That's Washington, the big capital city. But then in Virginia, you have all of these patriots who show out to show support. And despite all the claims and all the warnings about how this was going to be another Charlotte, you were going to have lunatic conservatives running cars into crowds and bringing guns and shooting people. There were going to be Confederate flags everywhere and all sorts of mayhem directed at minorities. None of it happened. To get that many people, many of whom were armed, to show up, to protest peacefully, to exercise their First Amendment rights in defense of the Second Amendment was really an amazing thing. And all of that bated breath, it was as if the progressive left could not wait to project some incident. They wanted some episode. They wanted something to happen at this event for which they could tar and feather all gun owners all across the country, and it never happened. It reminds me of the Tea Party. What's happening to gun owners now is what happened to the Tea Party 2 and 3 and 5 years ago. The Tea Party was what? Hardly radicals. A bunch of 50, 60-year-old men and women who would every one Saturday a month turn up at the local park, and they would protest too much taxation and advocate for the Constitution. If you listen to the mainstream media, you would have thought the Tea Party were nothing but Antifa radicals in masks. The same fawning coverage that Antifa gets, despite being violent, is how they painted the Tea Party. And so what happened to the Tea Party? After years and years of being unfairly stigmatized, sort of went its own way. We're trying to do now to gun owners the same thing. We're trying to pretend that all legal gun owners are somehow complicit in school shootings, that legal gun owners are white supremacists, that legal gun owners, but that to own guns legally or to promote the Second Amendment now makes you a white supremacist who wants to ruin the lives of minority people. This is how out of control, of course, the liberal narrative is. And the incredibly peaceful nature of these protests and the size of them stand in stark contrast, this tale of two cities, between the failures of feminism in Washington, D.C. and the Second Amendment in Virginia. That's a lesson that we really have to learn, and I'll go one step further. You think about the entire crowd that turned out in Virginia to support gun rights. There's only one person in the entire capital of Virginia who we know in the past has worn blackface and who has worn a Klan hood, and that would be Governor Northam himself, the Democrat governor of Virginia. Take a look at the picture that accompanies this video, and you will see that when he was a young man engaging in youthful hijinks, he pretended to be the very thing he tried to smear all of these patriots with about the Second Amendment. It's pretty pathetic that the person with the sketchiest reputation in the entire capital of Virginia with regards to these issues is not the protesters, it's the governor himself. But of course, being a Democrat governor, he doesn't have to lose his job, right? I promise you, if he were a Republican who had pictures of it like that of himself taken 20 years ago, he would not be the governor. So that's the problem, isn't it? That he gets to stay governor because as long as you're liberal, you can't lose your job. And I would argue the reason he's going after guns to some degree, the reason he is so unconstitutionally going after Virginia's guns is as a way of atoning for his picture in blackface dressed like a Klans member. The fact that he got to keep his job means he owes the radical progressive something. He has to give them a quid pro quo to stay governor and not be driven from office. And that quid pro quo, I think, is radical gun confiscation. He's doing this because he wants to pay back those in the powerful liberals who allowed him to keep his job when you and I absolutely would not have been able to keep his job. I think Justin Trudeau, another blackface candidate, premier of Canada, I think Justin Trudeau and Governor Northam need to get together and have themselves a tea party, a pajama boy tea party, and leave responsible gun ownership alone. I'm Dr. Duke, and this is The New American.